Today I'm joined again by Right Ruminations. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Todd. I look forward to the discussion.
So tonight we're on stage 2 of our series on historic perspectives on the right. We covered reactionaries last time. This time we're in the interwar period with the rise of fascism and National Socialism. So generally speaking, fascism, now of course, if you want to know what fascism is, you can read Mussolini's entry for the Encyclopedia Britannica, where you get it straight from the horse's mouth. But for the context of this discussion, a couple of things come to mind. Mussolini says that fascism is everything is in the state, nothing is outside the state. That's one of the famous taglines of Mussolini. The other aspect is that fascism, especially as we see it with the alt-right today, has this what we might call the aesthetic of heroic violence, where Mussolini says, liberals are soft and weak, peace allows men to wither, whereas war and struggle causes men to develop and to become heroic and to push civilization forward. I don't know if it's classical, though certainly there is a classical aesthetic to it. But I mean, obviously in the classical world, I'm not sure anybody would have said everything is in the state, nothing is outside the state. Mussolini's classic sort of objections to liberalism and socialism, well, his objection to socialism or communism was that it was egalitarian and sort of a populist herd mentality. Whereas, he sort of objected, like the socialists, he objected to the sort of materialism of liberalism, he opposed both liberalism and socialism and communism on the grounds of its sort of appealing to the mob. Now, the one interesting aspect about fascism is that unlike reaction, it did effectively beat the socialists at their own game when it came to populism. So while in Russia and in France, the right-wing forces were not really able to galvanize the peasants or the working class, Mussolini was able to do so and effectively defeated any sort of internal socialist revolution. So in this regard, fascism has learned from the failures of reaction and is able to at least win internal power struggles against the socialists. Winning world wars, as we saw with Italy, is a whole different issue. So what are some of your thoughts on fascism and some of the problems?
Well, I think that one of the problems with defining fascism is that the definitions that were put forward by Mussolini are not really congruous with the actual outcomes in fascism. For example, one of the central tenets of fascism is corporate guild economics, none of which are really followed in any measure in fascist Italy until after the Nazis invade Italy, at which point the economy is replaced by something which is more in the vein of the Nazis. But the economy in the early part of fascist Italy was something very close to a classically liberal or a free market economy, which is very out of step with what Mussolini had in mind, which seems to be, at least as expressed by his ghostwriter, Giovanni Gentili in The Doctrine of Fascism, is something that is very much, looks a lot like neo-Thomism in terms of its desire to sort of implement a lot of those structures outlined in the papal encyclical Rerum Novarum, in which you have this kind of very balanced system of negotiation between the working class, the ruling class, and the managers of industry, in which things will be organized into these guilds, which are kind of, I suppose, analogous to the medieval guilds. You don't really see that in fascist Italy. Another difference is that there is the saying of Gentili's and attributed to Mussolini, everything inside the state, nothing outside the state. So in other words, fascism is professedly totalitarian, but in practice, unlike Nazi Germany, the fascist Italians were not really totalitarian. They had a kind of strongman Latin American form of government, which was not a million miles away from from the more generic form of Latin, right-wing Latin strongman government, like say with Franco in Spain, or later Pinochet or something like that. And so I think that there is this huge definitional problem with fascism. And then, of course, you run into further discrepancies between fascism and Nazism, with Nazism being a kind of almost fascist Soviet hybrid. But the problem is that fascism itself, to begin with, was something difficult to really put one's finger on. I think that ultimately we have to go with reality rather than the suggested definition. So to my thinking, fascism is basically, it is a right-wing ideology in terms of wanting to maintain traditional power structures, hierarchies like the family, like the to a certain extent the church, or at least some kind of religious structure, certain communal symbols, ideas of patriarchy, I suppose not necessarily racial but ethnic distinctions. But unlike traditional forms of reaction, it does so in the context of the state. And it does so in the context of a certain kind of police state, but which is not necessarily totalitarian. And it's also something that takes on, I suppose, some of the revolutionary populist elements of the radical left. So difficult to define except by a kind of aggregate of these various, you might say, accidental properties. But that's kind of an overview of what I view fascism in the generic sense of being. And I think that it's useful to relate it to the question of the modern right, because it really is where the modern right begins in terms of having some form of right-wing nationalism, as opposed to the older forms of right-wing traditionalist thought, which tended to be more international and focused, like the Tsarists and these various networks of international families. And so I think that that would be an overview of how I view fascism in relation to its standing on the right. I think in terms of the problems, one is that there is a kind of cavalier attitude, I think, that the modern right has towards fascism, where they haven't really thought through the ramifications of supporting something so divergent from the comforts of modern society. And I think that they, like Richard Spencer, for example, was asked, by Sargon of Akkad in the debate that he had on the Warski debate. And he said that, there might be a danger of devolving into some kind of totalitarianism, but it's worth the risk. And I think that there is kind of problem with the cavalier attitude that they have, that fascism will not devolve into something more akin to Nazism. For one reason is that first of all, fascism, like Franco's conservatism, evolved in nations which were already accustomed to those various power structures. And secondly, in its less authoritarian form, in its Italian form, fascism was not particularly racialist. And it did not have the more racialist, I suppose, JQ sensitive expressions of fascism were precisely those that went more in the direction of totalitarianism and National Socialism. So I find that there's a problem, with having a cavalier attitude as to what the resurrection of any kind of quasi-fascist outlook would have in modern society. And then there's the second problem of when then people try to say, well, maybe we don't support what they have in Nazi Germany, but maybe something more moderated. Well, the problem is that the more moderated forms of fascism do not really speak to the same preoccupations that have taken the mind of the of what was called the alt-right. Those are some initial thoughts.
Yeah, it sort of sounds like how, with like some of the more, like real communism has never existed, is what you'll often hear from people on the left. And it does sound like that the sort of spirit of fascism that Gentile and Mussolini initially enunciated early on didn't really become manifest. Now, the one thing, though, I don't know as much about it as I do about Russia. In the end of World War I, Italy and Russia were the reactionaries and the fascists were dealing with the same problem: how to deal with internal socialist unrest. In Russia, the reactionaries failed spectacularly, but within Italy, there was a success. Now, to the extent that I know about Italy, its success was along the same lines as in Germany, where the veterans of the war, their loyalty to the state was maintained. Now, Mussolini himself was a radical socialist during the war. He published the Italian socialist paper, the Avanti. But he realized, see, the great problem of the Great War was that the working class did not rise up against what Lenin called the capitalist war, which had been predicted by Marx. And so the question is, why? Why didn't they do that? Mussolini's answer to that question was that nationalism was actually a stronger impulse than worker solidarity across national borders. And he believed that socialism could work within a national context. And he seems to have been able to win the support of the Italian armed forces. Now, even though Italy was a victorious power in the Great War, it had a sense of resentment like many of the Central Powers, because it had betrayed the Triple Alliance on the condition that it would be able to carve up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And at the end of the day, it didn't get anything. That all went, well, it got the South Tyrol, but everything else went to Yugoslavia, which is not at all what Italy had signed on for. And they're like, well, we lost all these guys fighting Austria, and we're only going to get the South Tyrol. We wanted more than that. So even though they were on the winning side, they felt they had a similar sense of resentment that you would see in Germany and Austria and other Eastern European countries that had been a part of the Central Powers. And one of the things he does do, though, is he does win the popular argument in a way that, and keep the loyalty of the army in the way that reactionaries could not get in Russia. And I think part of that was appropriating elements of socialism and saying, hey, look, working class Italians, we get it. You're tired of being exploited by capitalists. He played that rhetorical card and was able to deliver enough on the rhetoric that he won the support of the Italians. And the other thing is, fascism seems to be a junior partner to National Socialism, because once Mussolini was forced to rely more on Hitler for protection, as we saw in the northern Italian rump state after 1943, it's essentially a miniature clone of National Socialism. So fascism itself seems to have a less robust origin point and tends to go with the stronger horse in the race, if you know what I mean.
Right. Well, I think that that it is true that there is this kind of strategic viability, at least in its initial iteration, that you have with fascism and National Socialism. And I think that this is probably one of the reasons that the Frankfurt School was so directed in its attentional manner against the idea of fascism rising in the Western world, because the idea was that much like the worker solidarity, I suppose, had been supplanted by sentiments of national feeling, I think there was the concern on the part of the cultural Marxists, and partly hysteria, or largely hysteria, that in fact there would be a similar kind of venting, as it were, of the fact that the workers in Western countries had not risen up, and this might be fueled towards nationalism. But I do think that there is, I do think that the people, a lot of the more authoritarian elements of the new right, see themselves as, I think, you might say, playing a role in relation to the modern social justice and Antifa left, where they see themselves as kind of being the substitute forces who are able to properly combat the forces of Marxism in the way that the mainstream is not. So much the way the Weimar Republic was not able to properly suppress the communists, but the Freikorps did seem to be up to the task. I think that the modern right kind of, in its fringier elements, see itself as fulfilling that role. What I think that they do overlook, however, is the consequences that such an outcome would have. And so, unlike a lot of people, I do not believe that the idea of resurrecting fascism or even National Socialism is an impossibility. Actually, I think it's kind of frighteningly possible as an eventual reaction to mounting repression from the left. What I would say, though, is that there is a kind of naivete in what exactly constitutes National Socialism. And I remember this hangout with Millennial Woes and V, where they were having this conversation. And V brought up the argument, the analogy of, well, look, what happens? I mean, you implement an authoritarian structure, and then eventually that authoritarian structure is used against you. So look at Obama, for example, with the drone strikes, the right for the president to have a kind of kill list. And now the left realize that that is exactly the same executive power that Trump has in his hands. So whatever structures you create will eventually be turned around on you. And Millennial Woe's answer was to kind of shrug his shoulders and say, well, V, I'm sorry that you were traumatized by the horrors of your situation in under the Soviet Union, but with us it wouldn't be like that. But of course, the great irony is that Hitler was at times expressed himself to be a great admirer of Stalin in the early years, and this kind of relates to the economic realities of fascism. You'll often hear, or of National Socialism, you'll often hear people like in the same circles. Actually, I think in the same conversation, the issue of the Nazi economy was brought up, and Woes, who was always an avid opponent of communism, said, well, actually, it turns out that the communists, or that the Nazi economy was actually doing okay, and it actually wasn't that bad. But once again, the irony is that, I mean, Hitler said that Stalin's efforts to master the USSR economy was only rivaled by our own 4-year plan. So in other words, there's this great admiration on the part of National Socialism for elements in Soviet communism, in particular Stalin. And we know from the testimony of people who are, let's say, at the very least, National Socialist, if not apologists, then at least you might say, perhaps apologist is the right word, but that they certainly have no sympathy with the Soviets, but Hitler had all kinds of sympathy for the Soviets. So there really is the question of, well, is this really a pragmatic concern in terms of can it achieve the defeat of the left? Maybe long run it could. But the question is, do you really have any conception of what National Socialism looks like, and how far away it is from anything you would find tolerable?
Well, this really gets to the crux of the matter, right? A lot of people on the new right will say, well, look, we need to have something more hard-nosed to defeat the left. They'll say, well, look, what they'll do is they'll point to the interwar period where domestically, yes, Mussolini and Hitler did suppress socialist, communist uprisings, or at least proto-fascist, things like the Freikorps. But here's the problem. They lost World War II, and they didn't just lose it. They lost it badly. Now, the Italian incompetence is a byword. So, like, seriously, for a nation that elevated the violence, the aesthetic of violence and military heroism, Italy was a laughingstock. Like, I mean, even the French were better than the Italians. That's how bad the Italians were. So, I mean, on the one hand, the Italians had a better showing in World War I against the Austrians, which was by World War I a decrepit rump state. And the Italians had a better performance against Austria in World War I than they did in World War II. To put it in perspective, when they invaded Egypt in the winter of 1940 from two directions, Libya and Ethiopia, they outnumbered the British like 5 to 7 to 1, and they still lost. And they were almost driven out of Libya entirely if it hadn't been for Rommel's Afrika Korps. Now, if we look at the Nazis, obviously, with the Blitzkrieg and their strategies, they look a lot better on paper. The problem is the Nazi economy never really rivaled the Soviet economy in armaments production, and neither one rivaled the United States. The level of material weapons development by the United States on air, land, and sea in World War II was so gargantuan, it's really almost incomprehensible. Just to put somewhat of a broad idea on it, if you total up all tonnage of all ships built in World War II, the United States, by a significant margin, is greater than all the other nations put together. And that's just naval tonnage, not counting tanks, which the Soviets did have a slight advantage on us, and then aircraft. The Soviets produced about 150,000 aircraft on their own. We produced twice that. So there is literally no way. The fascists had an ice cube's chance in hell of defeating the Western democracies due to the industrial might that the Western democracies could bring to bear. Now, if they had limited themselves just to the Soviet Union, could they have defeated the Soviet Union? Well, here's the problem, right? Whenever Russia's weakest link is the peasants, right? They tend, if the peasants turn against the ruler, then, as we saw in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, it's over. The Germans in World War I capitalized on that by sending Lenin back to Russia to capitalize on this disgruntled peasantry. Napoleon failed too and lost. And Hitler's policies in the East, which were the most draconian, and when Nazism really earns its reputation, was not calculated to win the affections of the Eastern Europeans who had been chafing under Soviet control. We can argue, how much he antagonized them, how great were its depredations, but regardless, Hitler had no intention of building a cooperative base with these Eastern Europeans. And so they also weren't pro-Soviet, because when the Soviets invaded in 1943-44 to reclaim the Ukraine, they made the Ukrainians pay very heavily. So these people were just kind of caught between a rock and a hard place without any real allies. And so he didn't have a viable strategy in Russia. There was a debate between Vox Day and Greg Johnson. And Vox Day points out, this policy of extermination in Eastern Europe was not a viable strategy to defeat the Soviets. The people that already didn't like Stalin had no interest to like you, and so you couldn't capitalize on the discontent there. And at the very best you could hope is they'd just be ambivalent to both sides. And the long-term strategic planning of the Nazis leaves much to be desired for any. If you're going to fight the left in a world war, they didn't really have a grand strategy to win it. The Allies had the Germany first strategy, and then in the Western Allies, they had the Mediterranean strategy to knock out Italy and then to knock out Germany. Whereas, in part because Hitler ended up dismantling the general staff halfway through the war and ruling as a generalissimo himself, the sort of German organizational genius was stunted. Well, let me put it this way. When he invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin micromanaged everything, and it showed. Massive losses in the first year and a half of Operation Barbarossa. The Russians lost like 3 million men in the first year and a half. Ridiculously high numbers. Stalingrad, Stalin's like, okay, we need to let the generals make their own decisions and, put the commissars on a short leash. And they were finally able to deliver some victories. Hitler learns the exact opposite lesson. After Stalingrad, he doesn't give his generals any opportunities to apply common sense strategy. He dictates from a distance the tactics and strategies that should be used, which were not, since he wasn't privy to the conditions on the ground, he was in fact following Stalin's footsteps, handicapping his own war effort. And this kind of ultimately gets back to your original concern. Does an autocratic, centrally planned state yield the best results if, for example, the result is defeating the left?
Right, and also this really relates to the economic question. It's almost a kind of fetish in certain quarters on the right to express disdain for concern about the economy. But the question is, if you are so concerned with pragmatic thinking, how do you achieve your concrete, pragmatic, real-world results without a viable economy? On numerous occasions, Richard Spencer has said that we have to get over this idea of a modern, prosperous, economy and of a that it's all about standard of living. And you see the same thing, the same kind of extremity with respect to this kind of thinking in Julius Evola as well. To get back to the kind of to sort of link it in with the neo-reactionary discussion, but who basically said that something like the atomic bomb was in no way symbolic of the industrial accomplishments or of the civilizational accomplishments of the West, which to my thinking is just insane, because it's if your society is not able to keep its people living at the highest standard compared to other nations, then what does that say about its likelihood of being able to compete with them militarily, right? An economy is just as much about military production. It's just as much about the overall war machine, supply lines, things of that nature. And this kind of this sort of slogan of "I don't care about the economy, I only care about my people," or about virtue, or about national greatness. Well, how are you going to defend? How, as a nation, how are you going to have viable nationalism without a good economy? How are you going to have something that doesn't get that isn't in the situation that the fascist and National Socialist regimes were in, if you don't encourage something to foster national prosperity? In other words, there is this kind of idea that simply because there was, let's say, ethnic strength or communal strength in the old days, and because in the old days technology wasn't that great, that therefore if we have technology be not that great today, we can have communal and ethnic integrity today. And there's something really just kind of bizarre and extremely naive about that. And you really see it in practice in the Nazi economy. Tom Woods gave a great speech about the realities of the Nazi economy, which you can find on YouTube. It was given last year, I think, at the Mises Institute. And he outlines exactly what was going on in the Nazi economy, right? In order for people to make basic business decisions, they had to bribe government employees. In order for basic in order to, I suppose, deal in certain foreign currencies, they had to basically jump through a dozen loopholes. In other words, it was, as it's been called, the vampire economy. That is, it's an economy that was no more, there's no more reason to think that it was viable long-term than to think that the same kind of social democratic central planning in the West was viable long-term. And even less so, because here you're dealing with an even more rigidly centrally controlled economy under the authority of a total state. So the question is really, is it a surprise at all that that Nazi Germany was, I suppose, unable to yield the same kind of, like the Soviet Union, the same kind of capacity in terms of its war machine, given that its ideology was intrinsically averse to the kind of you might say economic circumstances and fixations that made the American war machine possible.
Yeah, and it also needs to be pointed out that the Soviet economy before the war and after the war was heavily indebted to the United States. Without getting too much into it here, Anthony Sutton, in his first volume of his 3-volume study on Soviet technical transfers from the West, makes a very compelling case that the only reason why the Soviet Union industrialized at all is mostly due to the United States. In fact, Avril Harriman, who was the U.S. representative to the Soviet Union in World War II, said that Stalin told him that about 2/3 of all Soviet industrial development was the result of the United States before the war, and then the remaining third could be assumed to be a conglomerate of England, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. And so that's also not really mentioned in the discussion. But for an ideology that prides itself, both fascism and National Socialism, on martial prowess, conflict, struggle, with other nations. So for example, right, Mussolini, you could say, is a heretical socialist. Instead of a proletariat, he developed the idea of the proletariat nation. The Anglo-Saxon powers were the bourgeoisie nations that were oppressing the proletariat nations, the developing countries, and he assumed Italy would be pride of place in the list of proletariat nations. They tend to have a view of warfare as essentially Homeric. You read the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid, you have these individual men fighting for honor, or it's a matter of martial prowess. We see a kind of revival of that kind of conception of warfare in the Middle Ages, but modern warfare fundamentally changes all of this. Warfare is fundamentally a function of money. Can you pay people to fight? Can you pay people to buy food? Can you leverage loans to pay for the war? Finance is extremely important, and the Nazis were not really able to finance the war effort, not in the way that England and the United States were. I mean, England ultimately, you could say, went into receivership and its empire collapsed. True enough, but the United States played its hands well and became the world creditor, or the world lender. But along with this, because, see, communism has a nice face, right? We're looking for the little guy. We're trying to protect the proletariat. We're trying to protect the little guy from capitalist exploitation. It sounds good on paper, whereas fascism doesn't really sound good on paper. It sounds scary. It sounds dangerous. So there's a really terrible PR problem they have to deal with, because if the entire global community is sort of opposed to you, it's difficult to see how you can survive. Especially when you give the global community every reason to dislike you by fetishizing violence. That's not to say that there aren't standards of hypocrisy. Of course, the Soviet Union was violent and repressive, but the way the global community worked at the time, they were willing to accept that. And for a time, they were willing to accept Mussolini. George Bernard Shaw said some very favorable things about Mussolini. One could argue he backed the wrong horse in World War II, but nonetheless, the die has been cast. And fascism has a very terrible reputation. And to be honest, a lot of these new right individuals, if anything, have embraced the bad reputation. And again, I don't see how that would have any long-term success for any right-wing movement today.
Right. Like, you don't find many people on the new right who, well, you may find some, but not really the people who I think we have in mind, who would say, well, don't worry, the Nazis may have had a centrally planned economy, but in the early days of the Italian fascist regime, they actually had a fairly free market economy, so don't worry about it. These things, it's possible to have this kind of regime with a free economy. No, what they tend to do is defend the National Socialist economy and say that it wasn't that bad, even if they're not actual National Socialists. Just one word about the Soviet Union. You're absolutely right, and it's something that Ludwig von Mises pointed out about that kind of economy is that the Soviet Union relied on its price signals from the United States, and without having adjacent free market capitalist societies, it would not even have been able to gauge any kind of approximation of its own production. Now, in terms of Italy, the question of the economy is a kind of ironic one, because they were poorer, I think, quite clearly than the Nazis were. Yet they did have the kind of economy that we would more regularly associate with prosperity, and I think that might be less of an economic system problem and more of a problem due to other factors, right? Italy has never been, since the time of the Roman Empire, it has not really been the major economic power, especially not in modern times. In general, I suppose Mediterranean societies in the modern period are less economically accomplished compared to what are often called the Nordic countries, for a number of reasons. I suspect it could be ethnic, it could be geographical, it could be sociological, religious, what have you. But the point is that I don't think it was because of the economy. And I think that, yes, there is this real problem with the National Socialists in terms of almost deriving their image of what war ought to look like from, as you say, a kind of Homeric imagery. There is a kind of romanticism. And actually, I read a book a while ago. I can't remember the name of the author, but I think that the book was just called Fascism. It was written sometime in the 70s.
Do you mean Stanley G. Payne?
I'm not sure. The thesis of the book was that was basically, it's a very dated thesis now, but it's one that's, I think, broadly accepted. The thesis of the book was basically that there's no such thing as red fascism. There's no such thing as brown communism. Basically, they are two distinct ideologies. And Nazism is not just state corporate capitalism, that it exists as a kind of distinctive ideology. And basically what they said, what the thesis came down to was fascism is basically the politics of romanticism. And I think that this being the politics of romanticism speaks to its inability to engage in any kind of rigorous approach to economics. It involves, I suppose, unrealistic wartime expectations. It can lead to basically, I suppose, a dismissal of questions of viability, because there is this this question, I suppose, this fixation on the archetypal imagery of how things should work, and the problems with with fascism in general, but I think National Socialism in a certain sense in particular, are really, those problems are really inseparable from that kind of imagery based politics, which is derived from this politicized romanticism.
Yes, exactly. And to go back to an earlier point you made about purges and centralizing power in the hands of a few men, the National Socialists really are a good example of this, right? We have the Night of the Long Knives, where he purges the brown shirts, his loyal shock troops from earlier in his career. So Hitler was not averse to purging individuals, granted not with the scale, the frequency of a Stalin, but we do see that this trend is already existing. And then furthermore, this is partly, I think, colored by left-wing propaganda that somehow wants to paint Hitler as a Christian, which is laughable. Hitler's, like Mussolini, was pragmatic in his dealings with the church. Both of them assumed the church would disappear in the long run, organized religion. In Mussolini's case, Catholicism. In Hitler's case, Lutheranism and Catholicism. Now, there's a couple of interesting points. So Richard J. Evans, in his trilogy on Nazi Germany, points out that the main reason why Hitler did not go full on against the German Lutherans is because he needed to win the war first. Once the war was over, he would then proceed to purge the Christian elements in Germany. We also have, for example, Erich Goldhagen, the father of Daniel Goldhagen, who's famous for the book Hitler's Willing Executioners. In a documentary that the father and son did about 20th century genocides, his father, Erich, says, look, Hitler's going to wipe out Christianity once he took over, once he won the war. So that would have been another round of purges. And in fact, Keith Preston, I might put it in the show notes, I don't remember exactly where it was, but he mentioned that the BBC mentioned that there was an anarchist who had survived Auschwitz. And he said when he had an argument with, I think it was Himmler, one of the camp guards. It might have even been Himmler. And he said, oh, you Nazis are good Catholics, in the sense that they were very obedient to hierarchy. Of course, he's an anarchist, so that's gonna be an insult. And then Himmler says, well, look, I mean, the Catholic priests are next. We just got to win the war first. So not only was there a bout of purges in the late 30s with the early 30s with the Night of the Long Knives, there was a large bout of purges that were planned if Hitler had won the war. And so for someone like a Richard Spencer or Millennial Woes to glibly say, well, it couldn't happen here, well, it did and we know that it probably would in the future. And people like Richard Spencer and Millennial Woes might be those purged in the light of the long knives.
Well, right now, just to say a word about the state of the church in not in National Socialism and Italian fascism. I do think that the church-state relations probably had some kind of greater longevity in the case of the Italian fascists than under the National Socialists, who I think clearly were only tolerating them as a kind of temporary measure. But I also think that it's worth pointing out to anyone who says that, because I'm kind of anticipating that counter-argument, is that I think that in terms of being a neighbor to Nazi Germany, what the Italians' actual stance on the church was, even in Italy, is kind of irrelevant. Because I think that ultimately, in the event of some kind of fascist outcome in the war, the calls would ultimately have been called by Italy, would not have saved the church. We'll put it that way. Yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, I specifically remember basically Sargon asking Spencer, why are you not going to end up like the French revolutionaries under Robespierre? And you could have said, just as perhaps an even better analogy, why are you not going to end up like the brown shirts in Nazi Germany? And his answer was simply, well, that could happen. It's a danger that we run the risk of. But here's the thing: it's not just that it could happen. I think that it would happen, because the kinds of you might say transitional forces that people on the new right represent are exactly the kind of people who find themselves in that position once the people who they have delivered into power occupy that place. I mean, it's not just like it could happen to be him, but the people who I suppose are kind of like the exact same thing happened with Franco when he proceeded to throw the Falange in jail after taking power in Spain. Another thing is that the big issue on the new right is on the you might say the fascist tolerant element of the new right is censorship. Well, what more censorious regime can one imagine other than Nazi Germany? I mean, it had the same kind of propaganda and suppression mechanisms that were present in the Soviet Union, and in many cases explicitly lifted from the Soviet Union. So these are people who are so pro-freedom of speech, with the exception of Richard Spencer, who admits that he's pragmatic on that question, but most of them seem like true believers in a speech, with some notable exceptions. Morgoth would be another exception. But they are people who believe that everyone, like I remember Millennial Woes saying in a speech that he thought that everyone on Earth had the right to a YouTube account. How does that square with not being severely concerned? It's not even that any of these people support the fascists or the National Socialists. How is that perspective compatible with not being severely concerned about the possibility of entertaining that kind of society?
Exactly. And in many ways, even though we could argue that, at least in one narrow sphere, the fascists and the Nazis improved on reaction when it comes to combating the left, in the end, they ended up with the same kind of cataclysmic defeat. If you look at Germany in 1945 or Italy in 1943, like say Rome after it was, well, actually 1944, when it was bombed to oblivion by the 8th Air Force, is that really any better off than Russia in 1917 or France in 1789? I mean, not really. The end is still more or less the same. It's not effective at defeating socialism. Socialism, see, it's hard for people to remember this because the Soviet Union collapsed in the face of the Cold War with the United States. Except for the United States, the Soviet Union beat all comers. it beat the nationalists. Okay, it beat the Allies when they tried to support the whites in the Civil War, and it beat Hitler. It beat all comers. I know it's not popular to say that, but it did. The only thing that defeated it was the economic juggernaut that was the United States. Now, that's a problem, because if the new rights model is correct, then why is it that the United States defeated the Soviet Union but not reactionaries and or fascists? It's a kind of a glaring flaw in their analysis.
Well, I think that I mean, this may be another. There may be an analog here in the kind of reverse direction with what I had said about the Italians, perhaps having certain economic deficiencies, which were more due to like non-economic policy things. I think that with respect to the Soviet Union, I mean, in defense of all the forces that failed to stand up against the Soviet Union, I would say that it took a very long time, first of all, for the Soviet Union to collapse, and the leftists are not entirely without a point when they identify the fact that the United States did not actually march into the Soviet Union and cause it to collapse, that there were the things internal to the Soviet system that were unsustainable, and that the United States helped to hasten that, but it was not. In other words, it's a highly contestable claim that the United States caused the Soviet Union to collapse, and I think that also, I mean, in defense of National Socialism and fascism, you could say that their mistake was not so much being nationalists or being fascists even, but their mistake was that they broke what Ralph Raico calls the first rule of warfare, which is don't invade Russia.
Well, one point to add, though, is, well, it's certainly a contentious claim that the United States brought down the Soviet Union. If we were to rephrase the question as a negative, would it be possible to envision the collapse of the Soviet Union without the United States? At least in the way that it happened historically, I think we get a very different answer. And so, for example, if the United States had either not been present or been completely isolationist, it's easy to imagine the Soviet Union just running all over Europe. Not a single European force really could have stood up to the Soviet. The Nazis came the closest, but even they fell short. I suppose one other thing that might be said is, for those who are slightly more sophisticated on the right, they might say, well, look, the Soviet Union was subsidized by the United States. We have Sutton's work. We have other works. That is true. But there are plenty of nations that the United States subsidizes that fail and are complete dumpster fires. For example, South Vietnam, complete failure, complete dumpster fire. Various right-wing dictatorships in Latin America, total dumpster, like Batista. He still failed. He had U.S. backing and U.S. money. So just because the Soviet Union had U.S. money and backing, not to discount how important that was, that's still no guarantee the Soviets were going to win. There was still something about how they organized those resources in such a way that allowed them to defeat the whites and allowed them to defeat the reactionaries and later the Nazis.
Right. Well, I would say that you might have a certain issue in time delay as to when it collapsed, but the problem is that you have to look at what actually preceded the Soviet Union's collapse, and I would argue that it really started. Basically, everything hinges on I suppose the consent of the public to a certain extent, right? And we've discussed this in previous discussions, that once the entirety of the public withholds consent from the ruling forces in society, it lacks long-term viability. I think if you had if you had the image of non-Soviet societies, let's say the United States is completely isolationist, eventually these people are going to start looking to what life is like outside of the Soviet Union. And in that sense, eventually the internal contradictions or the internal deficiencies of the Soviet Union are going to catch up with it, as it were. So I believe also you have to get back to that question of eventually someone is going to attack the Soviet Union, and yes, the Nazis and the fascists, they failed in defeating it, but you also just deal with the problem that they had, right? That eventually, the fact that you don't have an economy that is actually commensurate with the self-defense that you require is going to catch up with you, regardless of how involved the United States is. It's just a matter of time. So my point in pursuing this line of thinking is just to say that the fact that they weren't able to defeat the Soviet Union is not a cut and dry testament to the failures of National Socialism and fascism. I do think that could be there could be a potential danger of exaggeration there.
Well, yeah. Like, for example, right, the failure of the French Revolution, first to Bonapartism and then later to the European coalitions, would soon indicate that reactionaries were stronger. But within a century, as we saw with the United States and France and Great Britain in World War I, that the tables had turned. So one could say, yeah, okay, maybe fascism came too early. Maybe it was like the French Revolution, 100 years too early. Maybe. And yeah, it is a possibility, so we don't want to overstate the case. But the case that what I was trying to sort of push against was this idea that the Soviet Union was a good deal stronger than many on the new right want to attribute to it. And by extension, far left political and military organization today is, I think, far stronger than they give it credit for. In fact, Hitler underestimated the Soviets. He said they were a rotten edifice that just one strong kick could push down. He did give a strong kick, but it didn't quite come tumbling down. And again, I think that a similar overconfidence that plagued the fascists and the Nazis in their battle against the left is also present in the new right. For example, ultimately, this overconfidence culminated in Charlottesville. They're like, oh yeah, we're going to BTFO these guys. We got it. Well, that's exactly what the left wanted. They wanted that public relations disaster getting beaten up. And so that's really what I was getting at with that.
Right. And I would say that that with respect to, just to get back to the overconfidence question for a second, the cavalier attitude towards maybe you could get a Franco or a Mussolini, or maybe you could get a Hitler, or maybe you're going to end up being maybe you're going to end up being the one in charge. Maybe you're going to end up being the Freikorps. I think it's very important that we articulate just how naive this attitude is, because it's not just a matter. If it was just a matter of us saying, well, you could be mistaken about the outcome, or maybe you're correct that the outcome is more benign. I would argue that definitionally, the attitude is misplaced, that the optimism is misplaced. And here is why. Because all of the new right people who might be sympathetic to National Socialism or fascism, like Greg Johnson, like Richard Spencer, like a whole host of people who are perhaps less well known, but you can see sort of orbiting in that same sphere of the new right. Like some people at the Skanza Forum, that would be another example. They all hate Stalinism, but so much of Stalinism in the earlier days was admired by Hitler and implemented as points out, that the Nazis were as much influenced by the Soviet Union as by fascist Italy. So in light of this, how can you not be seen as intrinsically naive and misplaced in your optimism, when in fact the regime that you are saying could be very bad, but about which one could also be optimistic, was itself influenced heavily by that which you regard as one of the greatest evils in history?
Yeah, exactly. And and again, the military defeat is only one way in which an ideology can be defeated. What makes the left so enduring is that despite military defeats, like in the Spanish Civil War or in the French Revolution, it lives on, and it has like these 9 lies, the 9 lies of the left. Keith Preston once said in a conversation I had with him that National Socialism just sounds like a cartoon supervillain. It really has this really bad optics that even relatively, right-wing people, normies, would object to. And they haven't really done a very good job of pushing back on it. So, for example, the last bout of ethno-nationalism in the United States was the 80s and 90s with neo-Nazi terrorist groups like the Order. I think it was the 3rd iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. They ended up, mixing it up with a bunch of communists in 78 in South Carolina, and in a basically Charlottesville on steroids. A lot of people got banged up in that fight. And they always start off with love, not hate. And then what inevitably happens is as the media focuses in on them, they just start freaking out. They literally act out the very sort of narrative the left describes about them. And so it goes from, love not hate to race war now. And that already happened in the 80s and 90s. And we've seen exactly the same transition so in 2011 when the alt-right starts out, it's, love not hate. We just love white people. I mean, that's one of the things that Millennial Lowe's is famous for saying. And then it ends up relatively quickly, once they come under the microscope or the magnifying glass of the left, they then start to act out the very sort of worst elements that the left says is true of them. And the left can just say, see, we were right all along. These people are crazy, unhinged lunatics. And it's like, you didn't even learn from your experience in the 80s and 90s. You're just doing exactly the same thing over again with predictable results.
Right. I mean, since I imagine we're probably nearing the end of our time, I'll give some final thoughts. I would say that I want to make a note that none of these criticisms necessarily mean that I have any kind of personal hostility to the people involved. And actually, a lot of people that we've mentioned, like Millennial Woes or like Richard Spencer, or even to an extent Greg Johnson, these can be interesting people. They can be colorful people. There's certainly a lot of entertainment value in it, and opportunity for thoughtful engagement. But I think that that's in a certain way part of the problem, because if you go back to what you're talking about in the 80s, like with the 3rd iteration of the Ku Klux Klan and David Duke, well, these are people who, may be wearing Nazi uniforms, but they still like read Ayn Rand and drink Coca-Cola. And it's like, well, there's a kind of vulgarity to it. It's difficult to take seriously. Whereas I think that the certain elements of the modern new right operate with a more significant degree of sophistication, in that when they call themselves National Socialists, or well, maybe they don't, but when they express sympathy towards it, they really mean National Socialism when they say the word, right? They actually I suppose are more knowledgeable about what past iterations of racialism actually believed. So, they'll be very clear that they are open to things like environmentalism, things of that nature, which makes them more interesting. It makes them more, I suppose, intellectually viable. But the thing that I would say is that that doesn't actually make the initial problem any less present, that fascism, and in particular, well, you might say totalitarianism in general, but in particular National Socialism, is essentially an ideology which is undesirable and defective for the same reason that Stalinism, and for the same reason that the Jacobin left is undesirable and unsustainable, not only on a kind of ideological, intellectual level, but I would say also on a pragmatic basis. So basically, I think that the best thing that could come out of such a discussion, aside from just the kind of the open acknowledgement of what we believe to be the most precise iteration of the truth, is to basically make the point that just because there is a, I suppose, more engaging element to the new right compared to past forms of racialism, does not make, just because you are able to correctly identify the nuances of National Socialism in a way that's intellectually appealing, does not in any way make it more viable as a political system.
Yeah. Well, as you said, we are about out of time. So again, thanks again for joining me tonight. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.